Yes, I think it's likely that the fiscal year 2023 congressionally directed spending or earmark process will be very similar to the fiscal year 2022 cycle. Last year's cycle for 2022 included a lot of unknowns in the beginning because it had been a decade since Congress had the opportunity to direct funding to community colleges and other community organizations. And while the process was a little messy, it took nearly 6 months after the beginning of fiscal year 22 before the budget was finally decided. It ended up being fairly predictable in terms of the opportunities that were originally presented and the final outcomes that were achieved. What we do know will be different for the fiscal year 2023 process is there will be greater opportunities for members of Congress and senators to obtain earmarks. Last year's cycle, each member of Congress was limited to no more than 10 earmark requests. This year, that's increased to 15, so a 50% increase in the number of projects a member of Congress can request. Last year, members of Congress were limited to roughly $10 million in earmark funding for their districts, in some cases a little bit more than that. We do expect that to increase significantly for this new fiscal year, 2023. Yeah, for one thing, it's good to be patient. Congress moves fairly slowly on appropriations, the individual 12 annual appropriations bills. Although the fiscal year starts on October 1st, it's been more than 20 years since Congress has actually completed the 12 required appropriations bills on time. And of course, the last cycle, it took nearly 6 months into the new fiscal year for that process to get done. You know, a lesson, if your community college district is represented by more than one member of Congress, it's worth considering more than one ask, going to more than one delegation member. And part of the reason for that is not all members of Congress requested appropriations in the last cycle. We would expect that to be the same in this fiscal year 2023 cycle. Another lesson from last year is that we would expect there could be a large number of transportation project requests coming forward in fiscal year 2023. And the reason for that is last year, there was a large surface transportation reauthorization bill that moved through. And while members of Congress were limited to no more than 10 project requests of any kind, they had this other option. So what many members did was to introduce their road, bridge, highway project, whatever it might have been, through that 5-year reauthorization bill rather than through the annual Department of Transportation appropriations bill. Now that bill in the House of Representatives included more than 4,000 earmarks that went into conference with the Senate and ultimately was replaced by the Senate version, which was different, which included no earmarks, and that became what's known as the bipartisan infrastructure law, which President Biden signed in November. So I think you can appreciate that thousands of requests ultimately were scuttled in that bill, may be coming back this year as transportation appropriations requests. There will be no opportunity this year for an authorization bill because that's a 5-year authorization. So I would expect more transportation requests, but the good news is there will be many more opportunities for earmarks in this next cycle. Yes, in terms of deadlines, Senator Dianne Feinstein, Senator Alex Padilla have fairly early deadlines. This coming Monday, April 4th, both of them have set out as their deadlines. Other senators from other states have deadlines in the second half of April. Members of Congress have their own unique requirements in terms of deadlines and guidelines for applicants for congressionally directed funding. So there is no single deadline. You really have to do your homework. The House and Senate Appropriations Committees have their deadlines that apply to members of Congress and senators to submit their project requests, and those committee deadlines fall at the end of April. I'd recommend an ask of between $1 million and $2 million. Of course, if you've got a project that requires less than $1 million, you know, your prospects for success are probably greater. It is also possible to have considerably larger requests. In this last cycle, just for perspective, we had some success with fairly large projects. One in particular, I'll mention a $30 million university science building project, where we worked with a senior Republican member of the Senate Appropriations Committee who very creatively consolidated several earmarks into one kind of mega earmark for this university project that he'd worked on for several years. Another case, we got a $4.1 million earmark for a community college project working with the Democratic member of the Senate Appropriations Committee. And in that case, it was a consortium project. It included more than one institution. And that really seemed to create a lot of support. By comparison, we got several earmarks for individual community colleges in that same state that were limited to about 1.1. So in that case, the consortium approach was very successful. In terms of the timeline, first of all, if you really want to get into this game in this cycle, you need to move quickly. Fiscal year 2023 deadlines are coming up very shortly. After the end of April or so, when members of Congress will have introduced requests to the Senate Appropriations Committee, the House Appropriations Committee, those committees will begin to move on these requests. There will be consultation between the committees and the relevant agencies that become the conduits for funding. So just for example, if you request an earmark through the Department of Education, there will be consultation involving the Office of Post-Secondary Education, and they'll want to make sure that what you're proposing is consistent with the Fund for the Improvement of Post-Secondary Education, or FIPSE. So you'll need to be prepared to document that. When we get into late summer and fall, you'll see the bills come out of committee and they'll include earmarks. And that's really the opportunity for members of Congress to take credit for good projects that are coming through. This is an election year, so Congress will take a break as we get closer to November. And when they do that, they'll take a break from the appropriations process. We expect that will conclude, the fiscal year 2023 cycle will conclude in the fourth quarter of the year in what's called the lame duck session after the election. A couple of reasons that we expect it will conclude and not have happened what happened in the last cycle, which was delay the process by nearly 6 months. And the reasons for that are that there are several very senior members of the House and Senate Appropriations Committee who are retiring this year after many years of service. And the other consideration would be as a midterm election scenario, if party control of either the House or Senate were to change this fall, the party in power, i.e. the Democrats, have every incentive to complete their business before that change becomes effective with the next Congress, the 118th Congress in calendar year 2023. Therefore, I think you can feel comfortable in knowing the outcome of this year's appropriation cycle by the end of the fourth quarter of 2022. In terms of possible tips to recommend, one, be strategic in the team you put together to develop your earmark request and to advocate for it. I think it's important to include a representative from your chancellor or president's team. I think it's important to have colleagues who are knowledgeable about federal grants, grant writing, grant administration. I think it's worth having someone involved from marketing and public relations, and certainly someone who's familiar with your congressional delegation. Another suggestion would be, geographic considerations are really important. Remember the rule that all politics is local, and make sure that you're requesting funding from a member of Congress for a project that's physically in that member's district. And keep in mind that the district lines may have changed this year as a result of redistricting. So that's important homework to do before you get started. Demonstrating community support is very important. The House Appropriations Committee refers to earmarks as community project funding for a reason. They want to see demonstration of community buy-in. Therefore, it's very important to get letters of support from, for example, local elected officials, mayors, county executives, that sort of thing. Last thing I'll mention is I think consortia can be very powerful. We had really good results in this last cycle where we could combine the efforts of more than one community college district. There's strength in numbers, and I think you can look for higher funding levels if you take that approach.